The Honest Truth met Benito Vergotine.
Smile 90.4 FM.
Joining us this evening to discuss how a new ministry for land reform and rural development could be the catalyst to address structural gaps in South Africa's land reform program is the Chief Executive Officer at the Vumelana Advisory Fund, Peter Setou. Peter, good evening and thank you so much for joining us.
Good evening to you and your listeners. Thanks for having me.
That was an absolute pleasure. So with the Government of National Unity, we have seen the creation of a new ministry for land reform and rural development. Well, a ministry focused solely on land reform and rural development. What do you think this could mean for South Africa's land restitution and redistribution efforts, Peter?
Our view is that the new Ministry for Rural Development and Land Reform really has got an opportunity to refocus on land reform's challenges and really rewrite the narrative of land reform by addressing the structural gaps that continue to impact on the land reform program and really take stock of some of the lessons that we've learned over the years and ensure that we can have an efficient and effective land reform program.
What are some of those structural gaps that have really limited the progress of South Africa's land reform program?
In the main, the challenges that are impacting on land reform are well documented. And in this regard, two reports really, which is the high-level panel on assessment of key legislation, which is usually referred to as the Motlanthe report, and the Presidential Advisory Panel on Land Reform and Agriculture have really detailed a number of issues that continue to impact on the acceleration of land reform in this country. And this, amongst others, include the lack of government capacity and poor coordination amongst several government departments who have got land reform or who are involved in land reform or agriculture in one form or another. Corruption is one of the issues that have been identified by this report. The absence of an appropriate framework legislation that would help to keep policymakers and implementers on track and accountable. And I think this is key. We need to have this so that we can begin to hold the implementers accountable. Also, inadequate budgets and access to finance. For as long as we do not address issues around access to finance, we will continue to have challenges in terms of ensuring that beneficiaries of land reform can use their assets productively. Because the reality is, for most of land reform beneficiaries, they cannot get loans from the normal or formal financial institutions. And this is something that needs to be addressed if we are to make any progress in addressing land reform. Now, also, uncertainty about what land reform should achieve and the results that can be measured. We need to agree on specific tangible targets, and these targets should not just be developed by government alone. This should be developed by government in conjunction with the relevant role players and stakeholders so that we all have a common vision. Lastly but not least, lack of post-settlement support. It's the whole exercise of really giving people the land without providing them with the adequate resources and skill sets so that they are able to work the land. It's tantamount to really setting them up for failure. So it is important that whilst the land transfer process continues, equally, we need to make sure that we capacitate them, we provide beneficiaries of land reform with, some level of support so that they are able to work the land. And in this regard, we are conscious of the fact that government cannot go it alone. We need the involvement of the private sector. And organizations such as Vumelana Advisory Fund have over the last 13 years or so been pioneering, collaborations between the private sector and the beneficiaries of land reform. So we need to really relook at this and see what has worked and what hasn't worked instead of reinventing the wheel.
Because as you point out, the land has to maintain productivity, attract investment, and then create employment. And that has that ripple effect, as you're well aware, Peter, to enable communities to generate income. And that further can contribute to broader social and economic benefits for South Africa. You spoke about the private partnerships and how important that has been. From your experience at Vumelana, can you elaborate on the successes of those community private partnerships in land reform?
The reality is that you've got the communities who are awarded the land, whose land is actually restituted. Now, at the point when the land is restituted, they don't have access to finance, they don't have the requisite skills, they don't even have access to markets, which are the ingredients which are necessary really for ensuring productivity of the restored farm. Now, we are saying and we argue based on our experience that partnering with the private sector is the immediate and expedient way through which you can ensure that communities on the one hand have got the land, the private sector players have got access to markets, they've got the skill sets, and they've got access to markets as well, So partnership between these two parties will go a long way towards ensuring that the land gets utilized. As Vumelana, over the last 12 years or 13 years of our existence, we have facilitated in excess of 26 partnerships, mobilizing in excess of R1 billion in private investments, and thus putting into productive use in excess of 72,000 hectares of land, and positively impacting on just under 17,000 beneficiary households. Now, one could look at this track record and actually say, look, this is a drop in an ocean, considering the number of hectares that have already been transferred to people from previously disadvantaged backgrounds. But I think this sterling record, in my view, points to the fact that we need to really upskill, we need to upscale on what organizations such as Vumelana has been doing, so that we can begin to ensure that we have meaningful impact and ensure effective utilization of the land without necessarily having to at all times rely on government to provide the resources, because the resources are finite. As we know, there's a huge demand on the government fiscus, from education to a whole host of other social issues which government has got to deal with.
What do you think government can do? You mentioned that their capacity needs to improve. What steps can they take to attract investment to further facilitate land reform?
Well, I think this whole notion really points to closer collaboration with entities who are involved in this space. There are a number of entities, organizations such as Vumelana. I think we need more of a closer collaboration where we can agree, including how government can actually support institutions such as Vumelana so that they can continue to really support, the whole notion of partnerships. We also need to make sure that government needs to really have an open and honest engagement with the private sector, encourage them, and where possible, come up with some incentives so that the private sector can get more involved in supporting land reform projects. But also, most importantly, we've got communal property in excess of 1,600 communal property associations registered with the department, Now, the latest report that was published by the Department of Rural Development seems to suggest that a sizable percentage of these communal property associations are not compliant with the relevant legislation. Now, it is important to support these entities because they hold, vast tracts of land, So we need to support them so that they can improve on good governance. They can maintain effective social cohesion amongst its members by consistently reporting on development and in our view, good governance is really a key ingredient to successful land reform and a key contributor to high failure rate of land reform projects in our experience, because this leads to mistrust and infightings and may lead to destruction of assets by disgruntled members of the community. So government needs to focus, amongst others, on supporting CPAs. This is capacity building, institutional support. And this is the work that we have been doing as Vumelana over the last 10 years. And I think we need to do more in this area to make sure that we address all the remaining challenges that continue to impede on the success of land reform.
As you say, Peter, the new Minister of Land Reform and Rural Development doesn't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel, but there needs to be greater coordination amongst the stakeholders. There needs to be a greater collaboration, so that there is this level of trust. Where does one start with? You mentioned earlier the policy framework needs to be readjusted. Would that be a starting point from which one could then allocate the necessary funds and then the targets to measure the implementation?
Absolutely. Those are for me the key areas that the new minister will need to focus on, but also to expedite the implementation of the recommendations of the two reports that I've alluded to. That is the Motlanthe report and the Presidential Panel on Land Reform. And I mean, it's not rocket science to address some of these challenges. By addressing these challenges, I think it will go a long way to ensure that land reform becomes a success. But I mean, in addition to this, we've got the National Development Plan, which has got elaborate provisions, particularly on how to leverage agriculture as the primary economic activity in rural areas, and that it has the potential to create 1 million new jobs by 2030. We need to look at this plan and just get down to business to make sure that we implement it. As an example, the National Development Plan details that further that the current hectares under irrigation can be increased by 500,000 hectares through the efficient use of existing resources. If we can get this right, it will contribute towards bringing underutilized land in communal areas, in rural areas, and land reform projects into commercial production. And this obviously will require that strategies be put in place to provide support to historically disadvantaged farmers and land reform beneficiaries in collaboration with the markets.
There also needs to be collaboration and an alignment between the departments of land reform and agriculture.
Absolutely. The two departments would need to work very closely with one another, but it goes beyond just these two departments. I mean, people tend to forget that not every land parcel that has been transferred is actually for agriculture purposes. Vast tracts of land that have already been transferred. Some of those are actually for conservation purposes. Some of them are suitable for tourism, So the relevant departments responsible for tourism and relevant department responsible for conservation, all these departments needs to work much more closely, so that there can be more targeted support in order to ensure effective support for the beneficiaries of land reform.
Chief Executive Officer at the Vumelana Advisory Fund, Peter Setou. As always, appreciate your insights and time, Peter. Thank you. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Very much for having me.
Smile.
Smile. I love your station. 90.